Let's talk about some Saviors of Uldum cards that are currently not being played, but I certainly haven't given up on yet.
Hey buddy, watch this.
That's right, this video is going to feature 5 cards that are in less than 0.5% of decks right now, so totally lacking any sort of real impact on the Hearthstone meta, but I still believe they have some strengths, some merits that will eventually lead them towards seeing some play. So perhaps cards that you might be itching to disenchant in a couple of cases, but I'm saying, yeah, maybe hold on to this one because I think it's probably still going to be a prominent part of a deck someday. And these aren't just cards that I like rated highly before the expansion. I'm in fact leaving some of those off, like the Mage Quest I famously gave 5 stars. It's not on this video because I don't really see the potential right now. These are cards that have done something. They've given me a glimmer of hope. I've played them. They felt good enough that I think, okay, something about this is going to line up at some point. That's why it's on this video. So let's talk about these cards. Up first here, I have Rift Cleaver for Warlock. This is a card a lot of people thought pretty highly of. It was almost on my most overrated cards video as a really highly rated card that has so far underperformed. So probably not one you're going to be surprised to see on this list, but I think that the ratings were right. I think this card is still going to get there. And we've seen some evidence of that already. This is being played in some Zoo Warlock lists that are self-damage oriented with things like Diseased Vulture, Never Set Thrasher, where you're happy to take damage. Rift Cleaver helps enable those with some really big mid-game swings where you can destroy a threat, develop something enormous, and then potentially benefit from the self-damage aspects of this card as well. Now, clearly, this is not the perfect tool for like control decks that don't want to take a ton of damage. So there are some limited applications here. People may have underestimated how much risk is inherent in a card like this. But in an aggressive deck where this is kind of the top end, almost like a Vile Spine Cleaver in old tempo rogue lists, I think Rift Cleaver still makes a ton of sense. And as we see some meta shift around to self-damage Zoo, a card like this can pop in. There also might just be some mid-range builds out there of Warlock that are okay to take a little bit of a hit to the face in order for some big mid-game swings. So I do see some lines for this card to show up in the future. It's tasty to disenchant as an epic. I know that's quite a bit of dust you might be sitting on that you could use on other things, but I wouldn't take that risk just yet. This card still seems really promising to me. So now let's move on here to the Wretched Reclaimer for Priest, a card that I love, and I've had a lot of fun playing this card, and I would argue a fair bit of success playing this card as well. In combination with Leroy Jenkins and Embalming Ritual, you can play a Leroy, you can give it Reborn, you can attack face, you can use your Wretched Reclaimer to kill that Leroy Jenkins, and then guess what? Boom, you've got 2 more Leroys to hit face for an 18 damage combo, which is pretty ridiculous. That hasn't been utilized in the meta just yet. I think there is potential that could be a legitimate finisher. That's a lot of burst damage for only 3 card combos. But beyond that, Wretched Reclaimer has been played a little bit in some Combo Priest lists. When Combo Priest was near the top of the meta pre-nerf, this was popping in from time to time. And if you looked at the stats on this card, it was nowhere near the bottom. It was actually a pretty solid card in that list. It just didn't really gain enough popularity to make the cut on the most prominent decks. So it already proved itself a little bit in a high tier meta deck. And I think a lot about this just makes sense with any kind of Reborn or Death Rattle card where you're happy to activate that Death Rattle effect if the value is bundled into the back half of the minion. Something like Wretched Reclaimer can be amazing. It's cheap. It's got good stats for its cost. It's one of those minions that just feels really good. Reminds me of a bit of a Bloodsworn Mercenary for Warrior, which is seeing a lot of play. It certainly does something different, but it has that same kind of utility feel to it with a lot of potential upside. So it's just inevitably going to work somewhere as soon as the right deck lines up. A card like this, whether for that burst damage combo, whether just for some tempo strength, is going to make the cut. I think this one's definitely going to see some play. So now let's talk about Vecina. We already talked about this card a fair bit in a previous video as I ranked it as one of the most overrated cards in Saviors of Uldum, because a lot of people ranked it highly, but it's currently being played in less than 0.5% of decks. And it's insane because you look at the stats on this one, it has really good stats for both deck played, draw, and win rate across the board. Everything about Vecina lines up, but for some reason, it's just not making the cut in the meta. Murloc Shaman, Battlecry Shaman are taking the kind of Shaman play rate. And even though aggro overload decks are solid, they're just not getting any attention from the player base. So Vecina technically fits within the categories, the demands of this video. So yeah, I absolutely have to include this card because there's just a bevy of evidence that suggests Vecina is already good. Just somebody popularizing this build is maybe all it's going to take for this card to get there. And it makes a ton of sense, right? Because it's a reasonably sticky stat line for 4 mana. You're often happy to play 6 health on turn 4. That's amazing. And then just a card like Voltaic Burst is often enough to get value out of Vecina, instantly activating the overload, giving those two 3/1s 3 attack, or 2 1/1s 3 attack. It's basically like summoning a Restless Mummy, right? It's just right there with 2 cards. You still get to stick your Vecina for future value too. So whether it's like trading into the board, whether it's rush minions, whether it's burst damage, Vecina can do a lot of different stuff, and it's clearly a card that just makes sense. So I think it has to get there at some point. So now let's take a look at Shadow of Death. I'd say this one's a little bit more subjective. This is a bit more of a personal pick than something that's like driven by data or some evidence we've seen so far. Because right now, Shadow of Death has only really been tested in like Mogu cultist stuff that's not very good. It's got terrible stats because of that. But I still think there's a world where this card makes sense. We've seen successful stuff like this in the past for Rogue with a card like Faldorai Strider, where you played a 4/4, it shuffled in some 4/4s, and you were happy to summon those 4/4s. The big problem for Shadow of Death, of course, is that there's no body attached to this play itself. So you don't get that immediate 4/4, so it's a little bit of a slower play, which Rogue has historically had trouble with. They can't just take forever to achieve things, but there's also a lot more potential upside with a card like this. Not only are there like Leroy Jenkins shenanigans where you can like shuffle in a bunch of Leroys for burst damage, but just like big high value minions, right? Think about things like old Lich Kings or Ysera's. Shuffling those into your deck, getting multiple copies of those, having those come back for free could be amazing. So although there's not a Rogue list today where that makes a lot of sense because Rogue is playing way, way faster, I still want to hold out hope that sometime in the next like year and a half, some Rogue deck's going to figure out a way to utilize this. It could be cheaper because of preparation, right? So then it's less of a downside. You could set up a big combo, just set up a ton of value. Whatever it is, I feel like there's enough opportunity in this card, like the sky is the limit for what it can do, that cards like that usually tend to get there. It's, there's a chance it never lines up, it never makes sense, but it's just got an opportunity. It's got a chance. It does something potentially so large that I want it to work, and I think it will. All right, so moving on to our last card here. I have another one I think is more about like opportunity, the way it can scale into some crazy stuff, and that is Expired Merchant for Warlock, a card that's really not being played at all right now because it has a very specific niche kind of utility effect, discarding something really big and then hopefully getting multiple copies of that back in your hand. Just not something that makes sense for Warlock right now, not something a Zoo deck really wants to do. No reason to do that in like a Zephrys Zoo Warlock either. So a card that's just completely fallen to the wayside. No surprise there. But as you guys probably know if you've watched me, we've been experimenting some shenanigans with this card. Things like infinite resources with Soul Warden, making multiple Soul Wardens. Getting an infinite chain of Soul Wardens. In wild format, you can do some really crazy stuff with this card in Cruel Dinomancer, just creating infinite Cruel Dinomancers on the board. And those kinds of like infinite things often fall into shenanigan territory, right? Like meme, joke decks. But there's still a potential that they can do something really, really cool as well. Setting up some kind of combo where you just maybe get like 4 combo cards in your deck. Maybe it's Leroy's, right? Maybe you have like 4 Leroy's to your hand. I don't know how that would help, but that's an example. Maybe you put multiple Malagos in your hand for some reason. You got some discounts. I can't envision what the future would hold for a card like this, but I just know that when you can create copies of things that otherwise weren't supposed to be copied with things like legendary cards, burst damage, etc., then you, again, find those lines where it's like, okay, that's actually really crazy and only possible because of this card, and that means, all right, look, I think there's a chance some deck figures out a way to use this one really successfully, and that's why it's another one I think you gotta keep an eye on. And there you go, folks, the 5 cards I haven't given up on just yet. Keep an eye on these. I mean, some of them are rares. If you want to disenchant some rares, it's not the end of the world to recraft those later. But if you're holding on to those epics and legendaries and you're really debating whether you should disenchant them or not, just be careful, right? Sometimes, a good deck now, a good card now is worth more than a good deck in the future. But if you're trying to maximize your efficiency, don't willy-nilly disenchant some of these cards that show a ton of promise. So I want to hear what you guys think. What cards do you see that are currently being underplayed but have a ton of potential in future metas? What cards are flying under people's radar? What would you hold on to? I want to hear your secret future decks in the comments below as well. But until then, thanks so very much for watching, and until next time, game on.